the U.S. has a massive military, but it was a military designed for dealing with weak second and third world countries like Iraq in the 1990s. And, it was devastatingly effective at that. But we live in a whole new world. There are new technologies, and we have not adapted to them. Iran has. Now you can see, you're saying that you're wondering how Iran could possibly stand up to the U.S. Well, what's happened in the Red Sea in Yemen? The Houthis don't have like 0.5% of the military strength and or industry that Iran has, and yet the U.S., who declared that they were going to put an end to the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, they declared that many months ago, and they failed. They utterly failed. And the Houthis have continued to fire missiles without impunity. And just the other day, they apparently struck an aircraft carrier. And a high-ranking U.S. military official says, it's amazing the kind of stuff they have. It's just like the missiles that they're firing are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And look, if the U.S. military, if the U.S. Navy cannot defeat the Houthis, who are just, they're the very definition of dirt poor people, living in a barren desert. How are they going to take on Iran? Iran is so much more powerful, has so many more missiles, has a and they have prepared for war with the U.S. for decades, because the U.S. has been threatening them for something like 20 years. So they have been building these very massive underground complexes, bases that are buried deep within mountains. And they have thought very carefully about, what the U.S. strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And they have calibrated. Their military is designed to fight the U.S. Our military is designed to fight, a weak third world country from 30 years ago.
Okay, well, that's embarrassing, sobering.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's really true, and it's not an exaggeration. I mean, you can just, and you say, well, we've got, Top Gun. Well, our top fighter jets, like our F-35, so the Israelis have them too. They couldn't get anywhere close to Iran with them. They fly over Lebanon all the time and Gaza and, and destroy civilian neighborhoods. They do it with impunity there. But they couldn't even get close to Iran. They got within maybe 100 kilometers and they had to turn around because the Iranian air defense radars were already detecting their presidents and locking in on them. So what if you have, this fantastic aircraft or air force? You can't even use it. You cannot fly over them and bomb them. And Israel just does not have the missile arsenal that is even close to matching the missile arsenal that Iran has.
And neither does the United States.
No. Well, again, though, the United States would have to fire its missiles from naval platforms. They would have to be ship-launched missiles, and they've got some. But again, look, they use those. They've fired hundreds of cruise missiles at Yemen, and what has it done? It hasn't even slowed down the Houthis. And again, the Houthis are just like the dirt poor cousins of the Iranians. So what can they do?
Well,
and then the other part of it is that because of the U.S. president, all these bases that they've established in places like Iraq and Syria, all those bases are sitting ducks for the Iranian missiles, and they demonstrated that. Remember when they assassinated Soleimani, under Trump. Trump issued the order. It was one of the most worst things that he ever did. But he was assassinated, and in retaliation, the Iranians, very carefully, there was a very carefully calibrated response. They fired missiles at U.S. military bases, and they hit them precisely, like certain, but they gave warning to the U.S. So, all the soldiers went into the barracks, and they didn't strike the barracks, like they would hit a watchtower or some facility which was known to be empty, but they did it. They say we can strike within just a few meters of our target. Okay, and that was a demonstration. Basically, it was a shot across the bow to say that if it ever comes to a shooting war between us, we're taking out your military bases. They could take them all out. And if there are any ships that are at all close to Iran, they can sink them. And the thing is, the U.S. military understands that. And I think that's why they have been very reluctant to be involved in any kind of conflict with Iran.
So maybe somebody would say, well, with the Houthis, the United States, we're not really going after them. If we really wanted to, it wouldn't be a problem, but they're not worth their time. Right? Is there some other thing that the United States can do?
We've been going after them for months, and it's been an embarrassment for us. Let's be honest. The whole world's looked at it, and the whole world's laughing at the U.S. You think if we could take them out, of course we would, but we can't.
And it's not for a lack of trying. It's not.
Oh,
that...
no. There have been, I think there was, even just a couple of weeks ago, there was another strike on Yemen. But especially during the first couple of months, there were regular strikes on Yemen. Cruise missiles, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of cruise missiles were used.
Okay. And so I think it was the USS Abraham Lincoln that was fired upon by the Houthis. From my understanding, it was a mix of missiles and drones. And my understanding is that they said they shot down the drones, but I heard that actually some missiles actually hit the USS Liberty, and that's why it's on its way.
Happened. Yeah, right.
It's on its way back to San Diego.
The U.S. has not acknowledged that, but I think there's a very good reason to believe that that's what happened.
Right. So it's headed back to San Diego for repairs or whatever. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're going to try to hide it, but that's a game changer. So if the U.S. is going to try to wage any type of war against Iran, you think that it most likely have to go through their Navy, right? The U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy just cannot. They're just big floating tubs that can be struck with drones and missiles.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Actually, Iranian officials have said that when the U.S. Navy is right off the coast of Iran, the Iranians relax. Because the Iranians know these are sitting ducks, and they know that the Americans know that they're sitting ducks. So, if we got them right off there, then obviously they don't have any intention of attacking Iran, because Iran could immediately sink the whole fleet. But when the fleet goes away like 1,000 miles off into the Indian Ocean, then they get nervous because they're saying, well, they're moving their sitting ducks out there out of range. That's what's happening. So,
well, how would the U.S. hit them if it's not through the Navy?
Well, they could. Maybe they don't have to go 1,000 miles. It would. They probably. There are Tomahawk cruise missiles that can travel over 1,000 kilometers, maybe even 2,000 kilometers, and so those could be within range. And then they do have their bases in the Gulf states, and they could launch. But maybe those. They've always been
for
free
now.
They've always been free to use them, but actually recently, the Gulf states have begun, expressing doubts, and like in the recent attack, they did not allow Israel or to fly over their countries, their territories, and they might not allow the U.S. to launch an attack on Iran. Iran might say, "Look, if you let them do that, we're going to strike those bases, and maybe we'll strike your oil refineries too." They know that Iran could do that.
Right, but the U.S. doesn't care what these countries say. I mean, we're not supposed to be in Syria or Iraq to begin with. We're there.
Well, they do care what. Okay, yeah. So, but they do care what, like UAE and Qatar says. I mean, we've had a long relationship with them. Clearly they're starting to shift. Move towards BRICS, but the relationship is still there. And actually, I think the U.S. does have to pay attention to what they say. They don't want to be kicked out of those bases. I mean, they've simply occupied, parts of Syria and Iraq. But they do have an agreement with the UAE and Qatar and these other Gulf states.
Do you think it's possible then that, all these Iran hawks that are being put in the Trump administration, do they potentially are aware of the situation and maybe they're adopting the hawkish position just to make sure that they keep the money flowing from AIPAC and to the side of the Israel lobby?
I don't think they understand the situation. I think they're just, they're watching CNN and Fox News, and I think they're just deeply misinformed. Maybe one day they'll get a briefing and they'll be shocked, and they may have trouble believing it. And we hope they get an honest briefing. Unfortunately, a lot of these briefings are corrupted. And many of these agencies, the high-ranking officials understand that the Congress, the president, and the members of Congress, they want to hear. There's certain things they expect to hear, and so they actually just tell them what they want to hear. I mean, that's really, unfortunately, what often happens, and so they are never really informed of the reality. And I think that's part of the explanation for our completely disastrous Ukraine policy, is that a lot of, even what Biden was hearing, he probably even thought, he was given a rosy picture, yeah, we can destroy Russia, we can whatever, and because, again, our agencies are corrupt. I think there are still good analysts in those agencies, but the analyses that they actually perform are often never reach the ears of people in power.
Okay. Well, yeah. And so what kind of information are they being fed then? If it's just fake information, are they being told that, Iran's defenses were completely destroyed? Are they believing that propaganda? Like all the S-400 systems wiped out, Iran is now sitting down?
Again, I don't know. I don't know. I think, again, most of these people, members of Congress and so on, probably just believe what they watch on TV. And I think it is possible, that the truth has, I think it's even likely that the truth has filtered through to the White House and the State Department. That, we could see it, for example, on the issue of missile restrictions in Ukraine. Right, there was this push, and a very obvious push, to try to lift the restrictions so that Ukrainians, well, actually we know it's really not going to be the Ukrainians, it's going to be NATO technicians, could fire these missiles deep into Russia. But, so we even had Keir Starmer and Anthony Blinken go to the White House together, to convince Biden. And Biden said no. Now, I don't think it's just because Biden is a principled guy, but I think that it had been explained to him probably many times, so that even he understood, you can't do this because the Russians will retaliate and it'll be really, really bad. And so some, it's clear that the truth does get through on some very important issues, to some of the decision makers.
It's just shocking to me that we're trying to pick all these fights, or we're heading towards all these conflicts that we clearly can't win.
Yeah. Well, it's also, but it has been clear, I think, all along. And going back to even like Trump's first term, there were real pushes, of course, to have war with Iran, after the Soleimani assassination and then the Russian or the Iranian retaliation. There was a real push from people like John Bolton to actually just go to war and start bombing Iran. But we didn't do it. And I think, then and then more recently, there are all these efforts to again, by Netanyahu to spark a war between, well, first Israel and Iran, and then to draw on the U.S. It's clear that that's what he's trying to do. But the U.S. is, I think it's obvious, and it was especially in the first Iranian attack back in April, right? They actually communicated with the U.S. and kind of worked things out. So Iran would do this kind of demonstration and nobody would be hurt and whatever. I mean, the U.S. was, I think, completely in favor of that. They just they did not want the situation to escalate. Netanyahu did, but the U.S. did not. And I think it's because, again, that the Pentagon understands very well that a war with Iran would be disastrous for the U.S. And they managed to get that message through. Now, the
Does that
thing
give
is,
us some hope?
well, yeah, but unfortunately, with like this new Okay, well, these new officials that Trump's appointing, they're just such they're so insane on Iran that maybe those brakes will no longer be applied.
Talking about Pete
Maybe.
Hegseth?
Yeah, right. I mean, he's just a complete nut on Iran, and
He does seem to have some idea that there are some serious problems with the military in terms of interceptors and missiles. So I think he's maybe aware that the U.S. military is not in a good shape, and maybe that would hold him back.
well,
Kind of what I'm afraid is that maybe, well, I mean, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I guess probably bad is that maybe Hegseth might take the position of more just trying to revamp the U.S. military and start working on correcting all these problems and see if he can. But I don't want the U.S. military machine gearing up for war. I just don't
yeah,
want war. I want it
yeah. Yeah, well,
to get
I'm
along.
afraid again. It's just there are a lot of comments that he and other Trump nominees have made that it's just completely well beyond the pale on Iran. I mean, they're so I think there's a real chance. Again, there's been a sane faction that has been fighting the Iran hawks. I think going back 20, 25 years, because there's been this continual push. There's obviously been a group, mostly of Israel allied neocons, often, actually dual citizens within U.S. government that have been pushing for war with Iran for a long time. And there are others the realists have been fighting them for 2 decades. And we'll see. Fortunately, the realists have managed to stave them off, but these new nominations, which I'm sure will become appointments, could tip the scales in favor of the Iran hawks.
And then if that happens, war with Iran, then we
Yeah,
just lose. We just
yeah,
lose.
yeah.
Base is gone. U.S. Navy ships start sinking.
Well,
But then it gets scary because then America
yeah,
gets really angry, and
right,
then what are we
right.
going to do? We start
Yeah.
nuking people,
Yeah, I don't
like
know. Because again, like, how did we deal with 9/11? We dealt with it very, very badly. There wasn't any real, it was a time to reassess our foreign policy. How did this happen? We just decided well, they attacked us because of our freedom, and then we need to bomb Iraq, which is completely insane. It was just an insane response. So I'm afraid that we'll probably see an equally insane response if there is a kind of a disaster in the Middle East, in connection with Iran.
right. And well, do you think that this could bring down the U.S. empire, the U.S. government as we know it, if we do get involved in a direct war with Iran and it goes poorly?
Yeah,
Let's say an aircraft carrier sinks to the bottom of the ocean
yeah.
and the Red
It would.
Sea, and
Oh, yeah. It could be just say the beginning of the end. It may again. I don't think the empire is just going to fold up its shares and go home. That's not going to happen. In fact, like we're just saying, I think they may lash out. Things may get worse in the short run, but it could be the beginning of the end. It's just that it's like the first time where we really bumped up against reality, and we couldn't hide the reality from, the general citizenry. They've been told all along that we're the awesome top dogs, and there's just and Iranians are basically just a bunch of fanatics running around the desert. And then what? This is going to be a real shock. And again, I don't think the response is going to be healthy, but it may be like the beginning of an awareness that we're not who we thought we were.
do you think war with Iran is basically inevitable? That's where
I
we're
wouldn't say
heading.
it's inevitable, but we're on a knife's edge now, clearly, because again, Netanyahu is hell, and his entire cabinet they are hell bent on war with Iran and bringing the U.S. into it. Um, and the Iranians, who have just, again, have displayed remarkable restraint over the years and decades, really, have shown that, well, enough is enough. They're now fighting back. They understand they don't want war, but they understand they may have to have war.